All right, we now start the second episode for Thursday and the final episode for the year. So we'll continue on with Watergate. And as I mentioned to you in the previous video, Nixon was a bit paranoid about losing. He always had sort of a chip on his shoulder about people who were against him. And so one of the things that he had done was to form this group called the Plumbers, and they were originally formed in an attempt to stop leaks that were coming out of the White House that were getting into the press, and so that's the term Plumbers. But they were a secret organization who were doing really covert operations just for the White House. As it turns out, the American people will find out after the election. He was fearful about losing the election, but in truth he probably should not have been, because as you look at this map, it's actually the greatest victory by any president any time in American history, save for Washington. But if you look at the vote here, electorally it was a total wipeout, and percentage-wise it was a gigantic victory for Nixon as well, as he got over 60% of the vote, and that's unheard of. But the damage has already been set up and will become more apparent as time goes on. Now, what happens with Watergate is that the press, but especially a couple of guys who become very famous named Woodward and Bernstein, who work for the Washington Post, are going to begin to dig into these guys who were, the background of the guys who were caught bugging the Democratic National Headquarters. And although it will take a lot of work, eventually their work will convince the Congress to begin to investigate. And as they begin to investigate, although it's a very slow process, I actually remember some of this and it just seemed to drone on night after night after night. But by the middle of 1973, moving into the fall of 1973, it was pretty obvious that something really bad was probably going on. And as Congress was investigating, they found out that Nixon actually had a tape machine that taped all the conversations in the Oval Office. And with a lot of things pointing to the idea that the Oval Office would know something about it, although Nixon had denied, and had actually fired some of his staff to try and act like he knew nothing about it, when the Congress found out that the taping system exists, and because the Congress paid for the taping system, or actually the American people, as the money was set aside by Congress for anything that the president did, Congress argued that they should be able to get the tapes. Now, Nixon fought this in court, and he had already bowed to the wishes of Congress, and to keep them off his back, he had actually put forward a special prosecutor from his own Justice Department. But that prosecutor actually said Nixon needed to give the tapes to Congress. He got angry about this, and so he fired the prosecutor, and then he actually fired a couple of his own people who refused to fire the prosecutor because they said it would look very bad, and that's what was known as the Saturday Night Massacre on 10/20 of 1973. Now, what happens then is eventually, then in a Supreme Court case of Nixon v. USA, Nixon is forced to give the tapes up. He doesn't actually give the physical tapes up. He actually gives transcripts, and one of the transcripts claims that there was a part of a tape that was somehow messed up so that it could not be recorded. But of course later that will turn out to be what becomes known as the smoking gun of Watergate, that proves that Nixon knew everything about it. But ultimately Congress figures out what's happening, and seeing the writing on the wall, Nixon sees a committee in the House of Representatives vote to send the question of impeachment to the full House. Knowing that he's probably going to be impeached, Nixon will actually resign in August of 1974.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issue of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
And as he said, Gerald Ford does become president of the United States. Ironically, the first person to become president without having been elected either president or vice president. Nixon's vice president, who had been reelected in 1972, Spiro Agnew from Maryland, had actually been indicted by his home state on tax fraud and actually had resigned the vice presidency as well. Nixon had appointed Ford to become president. Ford had been the leader of the Senate for a long time, was considered to be a very honest guy and a real straightforward guy, although obviously he was a Republican as well. But there will be quite a bit of controversy that when Ford does take the oath of office, and very soon afterwards, he actually pardons Nixon for anything that he might have done. Now, although Nixon had given up the presidency, there were a lot of people who wanted to put him in jail for some of the things that he had done. And there is a conspiracy theory that, in a sense, Nixon said, hey, I'll make you president if you'll pardon me. There's never been any proof of this, and in fact, anybody who knows anything about Ford would be very surprised to find out if anything like that had actually happened. But Ford does pardon Nixon, and as part of it, he will say that finally America's nightmare is now over. And what he meant by that was that Vietnam, the protests, and Nixon and Watergate were all seeming to wrap up at about the same time.
Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
So Nixon became the only president of the United States to ever resign the office, as well as Ford becoming the first president without having been elected president or vice president. That leads us to the election of 1976, when the American people did something that was a bit surprising, but in some ways maybe not, and that was elect a Democrat to be president. In that the Republicans were blamed for Watergate, and all the negativity of the entire 60s and early 70s seemed to kind of come down hard on Gerald Ford. Jimmy Carter offered a very different type of person. He was a man who was a governor from a relatively small southern state, Georgia, and had no real ties to national politics, but he seemed honest, and that's the real reason that many people believe that he was elected. Although it was a pretty close election, but Ford was hurt by the pardon, and Ford was also hurt by the fact that the economy was beginning to deteriorate. But as we'll see, it goes really sour once Carter takes over, and he has to deal with that. So Carter wins. He seemed honest, but as president, he was not that strong. He was very idealistic, continues to be so even today, actually. And one of the things that hindered his ability to get anything done, as historians have put it together, is that he was a micromanager. He actually was way too involved in the little details of the presidency and sometimes lost the big picture, down to the fact that he even scheduled who played on the White House tennis courts and all kinds of little details like that. But the thing that made him look the weakest was the fact that in 1979, the Iranians overthrew their leader called the Shah of Iran, who had been backed by the United States, and the government that is currently in Iran today took over. One of the things that they did as they took over was hold hostages in the American embassy, and they held 50 hostages in the embassy, and this made us look very weak. The press really focused on it. In fact, a television show began at that point called America Held Hostage Day 1, Day 10, Day 100, Day 333, as it ultimately comes out to be. It's a TV show that is currently called Nightline, which is, I don't know whether it's still around. It was until last year. But that TV show really pounded home every night how weak Carter was. Our economy was bad. He really didn't seem to have an answer. The oil embargo hit us, causing the price of gas to go sky high, which actually added to unemployment. And really there was just a feeling of malaise, as he actually described it as president, throughout the country while he was in the presidency. So when he tried to run for re-election in 1980, the Iran hostage crisis really made him look weak. They did try a rescue at one point, but the helicopters were hit by a sandstorm, and it would have been very difficult. Some of you may be familiar with the movie about getting a few of the hostages out by working with the Canadian embassy that starred Ben Affleck, that was out a couple of years ago. But the hostages in our own embassy were kept until Ronald Reagan was elected, and in fact they were actually released from Iran almost exactly the same time Reagan was taking the oath of office in January 20th of 1981, which some people thought showed a little bit of a conspiracy. Reagan's presidency was actually a very positive one, and historians look back on it today as a positive one, although there are some things that he did that liberals were not really happy with, because he was a strong conservative. But he is very popular for 2 terms, elected in 80 and 84. Although he had been an actor, he had actually been in politics quite a bit. And whether it was just a coincidence or whether it actually related to the policies that he put in place, which were almost going back to the economic policies of the 1980s, he began to cut taxes on the wealthy again, freeing up money for investment. He also spent quite a bit on the military, which grew dramatically during the 1980s, arguing that we needed to outspend the Soviets, and ultimately some people believe it was the final nail in the Soviets' coffin that caused the Berlin Wall to fall in 1989, when they just could not keep up with our military building any longer. But Reagan was a pretty tough president when it came to dealing in foreign policy and domestic issues. And so because the country turned around and he seemed to have this very positive image, he's considered to be a positive president. He also won the 1984 election against Walter Mondale, who was from Minnesota, and that's why you see the blue state there. You'll also notice that the District of Columbia voted for him, but otherwise every other state voted for Ronald Reagan. Again, a huge landslide victory, although not quite to Nixon's 72 proportions. But Mondale had made the mistake of saying that if he is elected, he will raise taxes. Now, he made the claim that Reagan would not admit that he was going to raise taxes, but Mondale said, "I'm going to tell you the truth. I will raise your taxes if I'm elected." Now, one of the things that kind of hinders Reagan's legacy is something called the Iran-Contra scandal. And that particular scandal dealt with the fact that there were communists trying to take over Nicaragua. And Reagan had done some stuff with the CIA that Congress, run by the Democrats after 1984, didn't like. And so they investigated it and managed to pass a couple of laws that said he couldn't really do anything down there to help fight against communism in Nicaragua on a covert basis any longer. But the scandal was that supposedly, and I don't know whether it was actually true, although there were lots of hearings trying to find out the truth, that Reagan had traded arms for hostages. He had sold the Iranians missiles that they were using in their war against Iraq, which took place between 1970 and 1980. And or actually I think it was a little bit later, but in any case that they would use, and America got its hostages back, but he also got